Good evening, everybody. I'm Deandra Ryan Moss, an instructor here at Lambda School, and I am coming to you guys live from Bisbee, Arizona for episode 2 of the mini bootcamp. So tonight we are going to be talking about HTML and CSS. So let me tell you a little bit about Lambda School and about this mini bootcamp in case you're joining us for the first time, and then we will get into the lesson. So Lambda School is an online coding immersive. So what it is a school that takes people who are at the beginning phase of their coding journey. So anything from people who are total beginners to people who have a little bit of experience but need more. And we get them to the point where they can be hireable in the field of web development. So it is a 6-month course. It is full-time. It runs just kind of your regular work week. We do also offer a part-time course that runs for an entire year in the evenings, and we take you from start to finish. So we teach you front-end development topics, back-end development topics, full stack JavaScript, as well as some frameworks, deep dive into HTML and CSS. So what you'll see tonight is only the tip of the iceberg of what you'll learn in the main curriculum. And then we dive into a section where we explore some computer science topics. So look at some object-oriented programming, play a bit with Python, look at algorithms. So we really cover both the practical side and some of the more academic fundamental side, making you guys into really well-rounded developers. And one of the best things about Lambda School is our tuition model. So we do not charge anything up front. We have a tuition option where if you want to pay nothing and attend Lambda School, we are completely down for that. So we do an income share agreement, which means that once you are hired for the first either year or 2 years, you will pay us back our tuition over the course of that. So if you are not hired in that web development position that you're looking for, then we don't ever get paid. So the risk is on us. It's our job to make sure that we are turning you into the web developer that you are destined to become. And that is Lambda School in a nutshell. If you're more interested, if you want to find out more, and if you're interested in applying right now, reach out to Karen Zachary in Slack. She is the admissions go-to person. She can answer all of your questions about that. So that leads us into this mini bootcamp. So this bootcamp is just a 2-week course in which we introduce you to some of the topics that you'll explore in more detail in the main curriculum. So in this mini bootcamp, we cover all of the front-end web development topics. We cover HTML and CSS, which we'll be getting into tonight, and then we'll spend the rest of the course exploring JavaScript, which is a key building block to being a web developer. So yeah, that is pretty much Lambda School and the mini bootcamp. I hope you guys are all on Slack. As I mentioned last night, I don't monitor the YouTube chat because I am only capable of looking at one chat at once. So if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the Slack channel. I won't be able to address everything as I go along today, but I do keep an eye on it. And then at the end, I can answer some questions for you guys. So thanks so much for being here tonight. I hope that you had fun last night and are ready to dive quite a bit more into programming. So before I share my screen and we start coding, I'm going to just do a little bit of a review of some of the things we talked about last night. So last night we explored this idea of what is programming, what is web development, what does a computer programmer do? If you missed it, I would go and check out the lesson. It's all on YouTube. But the one thing I wanted to review tonight is this question of what is web development, because that's what this whole thing is about. So as a review, web development is all about building content on the web. And as a web user, you already probably know a bit of what that entails. Clearly, there's a need to actually design the website, figure out what content goes on the website, where it goes, how it looks, what the user experience is like. But there's also a lot to web development that you don't see. There's this entire JavaScript world that is, for the most part, behind the scenes. So front-end JavaScript is all about what happens when you click a button, how do you submit data, when things are moving around on the screen. That's generally a sign that JavaScript is at work. There's also an entire world of back-end JavaScript, which is even more obscure. That has to do with storing data in the database, security issues, like making sure that when you enter in your password, it's actually you, or that no one can hack in and get your password. as well as just general data processing, data retrieval. If you log into your Facebook and you want to see all your friends' posts, the backend has to make sure that the correct information is being retrieved from the database. Or if you post something, it has to make sure that the post is being stored correctly. So backend JavaScript is not going to be covered in this mini bootcamp, unfortunately, but you definitely get into that full steam in the main curriculum. So what we're really looking at is front-end web development. And tonight specifically, we're looking at the HTML and the CSS. So as a little reminder of what the difference is between HTML and CSS, they work very closely together. So I'm going to keep coming back to this idea to make sure that it's clear which is which. So HTML is all about the content itself. What are the headers? What are the text? What are the images, links? What is actually on the page? Whereas CSS is the style. So that deals with questions like what color are things? How big is the text? Where is it positioned? How much space is there in between, the content and the side of the window? How does it look when your web page appears on a mobile device? That's all CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can dive into this a little bit more. So give me 1 second. All right. So when talking about the difference between HTML and CSS, I'm going to first address this question on the most literal level, which is what does the code look like? What is syntactically the difference? And as I mentioned last night, there are tons of different languages out there, and one of the differences between languages is how does it look when we write the code? So that seems like a good place to start. So up here, I have a tiny little code base. We have a HTML page and a CSS page. So back to the HTML page, this should look fairly familiar to you guys. There are some elements on here that you are not familiar with, but you should recognize some things like the divs and the headers and the p tag. And so we can see that HTML is made up of these tags, these sets of opening and closing tags, sometimes with content in the middle of them, sometimes with other tags in the middle of them. And as also mentioned last night, there is tabbing and white space involved, but that is more for readability. So we can pretty easily identify an HTML page by the presence of these tags, and these tags that contain other tags and content. So now let's compare that to CSS. So we can see that there's definitely some similarities. There also seems to be some tag names present here, but instead of those being these like pointy brackets, we see that we have curly brackets instead. As well, these curly brackets seem to contain pairs of information separated by colons and semicolons. So I'm not going to break down exactly what's going on here yet, but I just want to give this takeaway that we can pretty easily identify what language we're looking at just at first glance by the syntax. So every single language that you learn, which in the scope of these 2 weeks are going to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, should be pretty easy to tell what you're looking at first glance just by syntax. Of course, it's more than just syntax that separates the two of them. As mentioned, they also functionally accomplish different tasks. So these two pages are actually working together to create a really simple website. So this page is giving the browser instructions on what to put on the page, and this page is giving the browser instructions on how should that look. So I'm actually going to open up this page, and as a note, while we're mostly working in sandbox environments like CodePen, which automatically render a page, when you actually have just a regular code base open, it's your responsibility to open the code yourself. So in the case of an HTML page, you can actually open it in the browser. So HTML is designed to be read by a browser. So if you ever have an HTML page that you're working on locally on your computer and you want to see what it looks like, you can go ahead and open it. So I'm going to do that in Chrome right now. So I'll just go over to Chrome, go to Open File, and I have this HTML page right here. and I open it and it renders. So not the most sophisticated web page, but let's look at what is HTML and CSS up here. So the content, if we scroll over, we see all the text on here is written out in the HTML page. Of course, it's also partitioned based on which element they're in. And then we also have the instructions for an image to pop up here. Once again, I'll dive into how images work in detail later. So we can see that the text and the image are all part of HTML. But what about the background? We see that there's a blue background. We can also see that there's some font differences between our headers. That's all happening over here in the CSS page. And just to really drive this point home, I've actually opened a same copy of this page missing the CSS. So if we look over here, it becomes really clear what is CSS and what is HTML. All the content is still on the page, but notice that the background's missing, the differences in font are missing, there's some spacing between the elements and spacing between the side of the page and where the text starts. That's all gone. So using this example, we can start to get a little bit of an intuitive understanding of what is CSS versus what is HTML. So hopefully that gives you guys a pretty good idea of basically what is the difference. So now I'm going to go ahead and move on over to CodePen so that we can dive a little bit more into HTML and then start to learn some CSS. So over here, now we're in our sandbox environment. So once again, the kind of difference between dealing with a local code base like this versus a sandbox environment is this just makes it very clear what's going on immediately. So over here, you would actually have to change code, save the file, and then reopen it or refresh it in the browser. Whereas in our sandbox environment, things render automatically. So it's a really good tool when you're first starting to learn and you want to have immediate feedback about what you're writing. So, okay, let's go ahead and put some things on our page here. So I'm going to, let me minimize the CSS window. And let's review some of the elements that we learned last night. So one of the most basic HTML elements is going to be our div. And as a syntax reminder, we always take the tag name, put it in between these two brackets, and then we have a closing tag that looks exactly the same except with a slash there to indicate closing. So divs often contain other elements. So I'll go ahead and throw an H2 in here. And then maybe a P for some text. So we have some very basic HTML going on here. I might also have another div below here, and perhaps this one contains a couple of spans. And as a reminder, one of the things that differentiates spans from some other elements is that when we create separate spans, they appear completely inline. So they're right next to each other on the page. I know that there were a lot of questions last night about what exactly is a span, what is it used for. And I think that as we dive a little later into some of the CSS, that might become a little more clear. So up here, I've put up on the page the 4 elements that we learned last night. The span, div, p, and, well, technically headers are 6 elements, but one example of a header. And just as a reminder, it's really important when we're writing HTML to think about how are things nested. So we have this div element, and within it, there are 2 more elements, a header and a paragraph. And then that closes, and afterwards, there's a second div that contains these 2 spans. So even though right now the divs are invisible, there's kind of 2 different boxes going on. And if I want to make that really clear, I can just do some quick CSS. Once again, don't worry exactly right now about what I'm doing here. It will be explained shortly. Oops. Okay. So if I go ahead and use CSS to throw a border around those divs, now, whereas they were sort of invisible before, it becomes really clear, okay, there's two different containers on the page here, each containing several elements. And that is what HTML is all about. It's a lot of nesting of elements in ways that functionally make sense on the page. And oh, and I just noticed a question about using CodePen and how things are on the side. So that's answered on Slack, but I did want to mention that because I really like it oriented this way. So just do change view, and you can change the way that things are oriented on CodePen. So that's a little bit of an aside. But yeah, so that's a little review of the elements that you saw last night. Hopefully you got pretty comfortable using them with the homework last night. So now I want to explore some other elements. So I want to look at images and anchors. And so anchors are essentially links. So I will go ahead and in this element throw in an image and an anchor. So the two tag names are image and a. So first note is that image is self-closing. So we can see that the syntax is slightly different on images. Instead of what we might think, which is to have an opening and a closing tag, we actually just put that slash within the tag. So there are a handful of elements in HTML that are self-closing. And you can basically think of them as elements that can't contain anything else. So whereas a paragraph will most likely contain text, and a header will contain text, and divs will contain other elements, you can't really have anything in an image except the image itself. So anchors, on the other hand, or links, you definitely want to contain text, so something that you can click. So I am a link. Okay, so you might have noticed that, first of all, the image doesn't seem to be appearing. And as well, the anchor, the text appears, but it's definitely not clickable. So that's because in order to get images and anchors to work functionally, they need to have something called an attribute. So this is a slightly more advanced but very critical concept with HTML. The most basic thing with HTML is your tag name, but sometimes you need a little something extra. In the case of an image, we need to know what is the image. So we have an attribute called source, spelled SRC. So we do source equals, and then we put a link to our image. So it could be a link to if we're working in a code base, it could be a link to a file that exists in our code base. For now, we will just do an actual URL of an image. So I have this image pulled up. I'm going to copy the URL of it, and then we come back here and I put this in the source. And now it pops up. So here is our fully functional image. Let me break down that syntax one more time because this is a little different from what we've seen so far. So first of all, we need the source attribute. This is one of those examples where it has to be precise. We can't spell out source or it's not going to work. It's SRC. And we have to precisely say SRC equals, and then we have our link in quotes. So single quotes works, double quotes works, and no quotes does not work. So we definitely need that image in quotes. So here it is. All right, so that is an image. As a review, it has a self-closing tag, which means that we don't have to write a separate tag closer. It has the attribute of source, which is spelled SRC, and then we do equals the link and the link for the image that we want to appear. So the anchor tag, the link, works very similarly. The attribute name is slightly different. It's href. And once again, this needs to be precise. I think a really common hang up for new programmers is mixing up source and href. That's something that you can always look up online if you forget. And once you practice it a few times, you'll be writing hrefs and sources in your sleep. So once again, you have the attribute name and equals, and then you have the link. So if we want to link to, let's say, Lambda School, then we can link it like that. And so one little thing that you have to do inside of CodePen is you have to do target equals blank. Let's make sure I got that. Oop. I think it wants an HTTP, or no, it's .com. I don't know why I thought it was .org. Let's try that again. No. So unprepared. 1 second, guys. Let's try this. Well, I apparently can't remember Lambda School's website, so let's try Google instead. That is weird. Okay, I think that this might be CodePen being slightly uncooperative. Sometimes they're difficult with these hrefs, but let's use this as an opportunity to practice Googling. So I'm going to Google CodePen. Oh, did I forget the D in Lambda? Oh, geez. Thanks, guys. It's always the simple things. Let's try. I'm just going to open Lambda School. So lambdaschool.com. That's definitely right. I'll try this. Oop. Well, there we go. So the target blank would have opened it in a different page, but you can just open it here. Unfortunately, now our pen has slightly disappeared. Oh, I forgot the underscore before blank. I promise you guys, I know how to code. All right, let's try it now. Yay, we got it. Okay, here we go. So a second attribute is this target. And so if we want a link to open in a new window, we can use the attribute target equals underscore blank. And once again, this has to be syntactically precise, as I just demonstrated by foolishly forgetting the underscore. And when we put this in, it indicates that our link should open in a new page. And so that is how links work. If we want the link to open in the same page, we just get rid of this attribute. So there you have it. So images and anchors. They're hopefully not too out of the scope of what you've worked with before, but we have now introduced this idea of an attribute. And so once again, attributes they're built into HTML. We can't invent our own attributes, and just certain elements have certain attributes that allow them to work. As we saw, an image will not work without a source attribute. An anchor will not go anywhere without an href. And then there are cases where they're optional, such as the target attribute, which is useful if you want your link to open in a new page, but not necessary if you don't. So there is an image and an anchor for you. The last set of elements I want to introduce you to are lists. And lists are a little more complex as well. So I'm going to get rid of a couple of the things on the page here so that we can check out our list uncluttered. So goodbye to the image, goodbye to the anchor. All right, so lists involve multiple tag names, up to 3, usually 2. So we have, first of all, an unordered list and an ordered list. So UL stands for unordered list, OL stands for ordered list. And these are the tags we want to use, depending on which list we want. Unordered lists will default to putting our lists on bullets. Ordered lists will default to numbers. In my experience, unordered lists are almost always what you use, and you tend to overwrite the automatic bullets anyways. So, but it's a good starting point to just think about the distinction between these two and to think about the difference between bullets versus numbers. So we start off with a an unordered list. Yeah, let's start off with the unordered list. So we start off with the UL tag, but then we need a second tag inside of this to actually create our list items. So LI stands for list items. So let's say that we wanted a list of, let's do a list of vegetables. So our first list item might be lettuce, and then maybe we have, let's see, I'm blinking, like cucumbers. I'm always worried because like all these vegetables that you think of are vegetables are actually secretly fruit, like squash, actually a fruit. We could also do cabbage, that I believe is a vegetable, etc. So here we go. So as we put list items on, they appear in bullets. But what's really notable about the list is that it's the first time that we've seen two different tags that necessarily work together. So if I got rid of this and just started putting list items down, the formatting gets kind of wacky. The items still appear on the page, there's still the bullets, but it's not really working the way it's supposed to. So the list item should always appear within the unordered list tags or the ordered list tags. So if we instead want another list, let's do let's go ahead and call this topics covered in the MVC. So topics covered in the mini bootcamp. So we know that the first topic is HTML, which we are learning about right now. The next topic is going to be CSS, which we will learn about shortly. And then finally, starting tomorrow, we will learn about JavaScript. So now we've used the same syntax of LI, but because it's in between two ordered list tags, it knows to put the list on the page with some numbers. So that is how unordered and ordered lists work. Not too different from the elements you've already learned about, but there's just kind of this extra complication that you have to have these two different tags cooperate together in a certain way, or else things start to get a little wacky. So make sure that you're starting with either a UL or an OL tag and closing that off, and then within that, you can have as many list items as you'd like. And oh no, someone on Slack has let me know that cucumbers are actually a fruit. That is tragic. Well, let's see, what's a better vegetable? How about, are peppers fruits? I'm totally getting off topic. But okay, so we won't worry about the missing second vegetable. May it live in mystery forever. Spinach, great suggestion. Thank you. Saved by the crowd once again. All right, so here we go. We have two different sets of lists. And those are all the elements that I want to show you for this entire course. But I do want to mention that there are more elements, and I think that you guys should check them out online. So if we go ahead and just Google HTML elements, things start to pop up. Check it out. There's a BR, which you guys have not learned yet, but you should hopefully recognize that's self-closing. If you go to, as I showed you last night, if you go to Mozilla's page or W3 Schools, you can start to look up. And actually, I really like this page because there is just a total list of every single element. So yeah, there are a lot. To be fair, most of these are rarely used, but there are a lot here, and feel free to check out this documentation. Feel free to play around with some new elements, whether it's later or if you get done early with your homework. You're always welcome to explore outside of the scope of what's taught here, because there's tons of online resources when it comes to this stuff. All right, so that is HTML for you. Now we're going to switch a little bit over to CSS and start to look at how we might style our web pages. So as a reminder, CSS is all the styling. So we saw this little example of a CSS-less page versus a page with CSS. So that'll give us a little idea of what's coming next. The first thing I want to cover is this idea of how do the CSS page and the HTML communicate with each other. So dragging this up, let me actually just go ahead and do a simple bit of CSS for you here. So let's do. So clearly, these pages are communicating in some way because the CSS is rendering on screen, the HTML is. And so this is one area where CodePen is really nice, but it also sometimes obscures what's really going on. So when you're working in CodePen, all you have to do is write HTML in the HTML tab, write CSS in the CSS tab, and everything will work out great. And that's really nice. That saves us a little bit of hassle. It allows us to get comfortable with each without worrying about it too much. But I don't want you guys to go in totally blind. So I'm going to take a minute to pull back up that code base and talk about what's really going on. As I showed you when I opened this page, I opened it from the HTML file. So the browser is designed to read HTML files. If I tried instead to open up the CSS file, things wouldn't work out so well. Browsers are not designed to read CSS. They're not designed to read CSS explicitly. They're designed to first and foremost read HTML. And that means that from our HTML page, we need somewhere where we say, hey, also there's a style sheet. So over here in my actual HTML page, there's something over here called the head. And this is not something we're really digging into too much in this mini bootcamp because CodePen, this is another thing that CodePen hides from you. But when you're actually writing out a document, locally, you need a head which contains some metadata. One thing it contains is the title, which if you'll notice is what appears up here on the tab. Another thing it might contain is a link to a style sheet. So over here in my HTML, I'm saying, hey, there's a file that exists in the same code base. It's called styles.css, and we want to import it and read it. And in this way, the browser reads first the HTML file, but within that, there's instructions saying also read the CSS file. If we wanted to, we could also directly write in CSS totally in our file using something called a style tag. So using this, we could actually write CSS code directly inside of here. But that's a good way to test things out, but professionally speaking, you would never put your CSS directly in your document. You want to keep those separate. So that's a little behind the scenes of how these two files communicate. Once again, that's not really need to know for this course, but it's a good thing to keep in mind, and it's something you might be interested in exploring in on your own. So now let's go back. Now that we've seen a little bit of what's going on behind the scenes and we know how to think about HTML and CSS and how they relate, we can now forget about it and go into CodePen where we're allowed to just write things directly in the CSS tab without worrying about linking things together. So let's talk a little bit about this CSS syntax. So as mentioned near the beginning, it's a little bit different from HTML. We start out with something called a selector. And for starters, our selector will always be a tag name, a type of element. So in this case, I'm saying, I would like to select all the divs on the screen. And then we follow that by curly brackets. Within the curly brackets, we're going to give instructions on how we want to style whatever we've selected. So within the curly brackets, there will always be pairs. So the pairs are going to be properties and values. So properties are different things we can style. And once again, these are things that are built into CSS. So I couldn't just make up my own. So color refers to text color, but I couldn't say text color because that is not a property in CSS. It's called color. And we have to label it how it specifically is in CSS. And once again, these things are well documented online, so you don't have to memorize them, but you will start to memorize the basic ones as you practice. So we start out with the property, so we want to set color, and then we follow it with a value. So what color do we want it to be? Blue. Once again, these things are not, we can't type anything in here. I couldn't just make up a color. I think baby blue might be built in. It's not. So if I did baby blue, that's not built into HTML, or that's not built into CSS, so nothing happens. But instead, if I did light blue, that is a color that CSS knows, so things appear in light blue, or I could just do blue. So once again, if you want to know which colors are valid, a good place to look would be in the documentation. You can also do hexadecimal colors, and if you look up a color picker, HTML color picker, or a hexadecimal color picker, you can get really precise. But for now, we'll just stick with simple colors like blue. So that is the gist of CSS. That's pretty much all there is to it, is we select something we want to style, we have some brackets, and then we start to actually do the styling logic within them. So we can do more than one pair within here. So we could also do background color is another option, and we could make that pink. This is going to be a really ugly website, by the way. So now we have color, background color, and we can do however many pairs we want within here. So let's talk about a few of the common property value pairs that we will see. So color and background color are extremely common. Another one we'll often see is height and width. So if we do height, and this will be in pixels. It doesn't necessarily, there are other formats that we could do this in apart from pixels, but that's a good place to start. So if I explicitly set the height and width, notice that before I set the height and width, that the div will go all the way to the end of the screen and be exactly as tall as is needed to contain the content. But once I explicitly state the height and width, now it conforms to what I've instructed it to do. So there's height and width for you. Another common one that I sort of showed you but mostly rushed through is border. So border looks a little bit different. So border, instead of just having one value, there are 3 values that are needed. We need how thick the border is, the style of it, which could be solid, dashed. There are some other options. I think dotted might be one. And then the color. So this is, the syntax on this is slightly different. Instead of just one value, we have 3. If we wanted to set these separately, we could as well, but I usually just do it in one go. So now we see that this thing has a border around it. If we want to mess with the thickness or make it dashed, we're welcome to do all of those things as well. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is font size. So as we've seen, there is some font size business going on already. Actually, let me select a different element for this. So right now, everything is applied to the div. And notice that all of the elements within the div, these headers and these lists, are affected by this. But instead, if we want to select something within, like let's say the H2, as we know, H2s have a default size, but we can always override that in here. So if I want to do font size 10 pixels, I can make the header smaller. That looks about how it was before. I could make it larger. Let's do 16. And then if I wanted, of course, to affect the font size of the list items, I could grab those as well. And let's go ahead and make those a little smaller. That's not very readable, but there we go. So point being that we can select anything on the screen and any element and start to tweak the values of it. And in this way, we change the styling of the page. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is something called the box model. So the box model, let me pull up an image. So the idea is that every HTML element can be thought of as the series of boxes. So outside of the element is something called the margin. So if we think about this as being a div, on the outside is the margin. So if we look over here at our pen, we see that right now there is a little bit of some default space, but there's pretty much not any space around the outside. In fact, let me make this even more clear by throwing another div on here. So notice I've thrown a second div on here, and all of the styling still applies to it. So notice that there is no space in between these two divs. That's because there's no margin. So if I tweak the margin, let's just make it 5 pixels. Now all of a sudden, on every side of each of these divs, there's a 5 pixel margin. If I up it, we see it gets bigger. So that is a margin. It's the space outside of the element. The next thing in our box model is the border. And we've already seen a little bit of that. So right now we have a 5 pixel border. So we have outside 10 pixels, then a 5 pixel border. After the margin is the padding. So the padding is inside of the border, but outside of the content. So notice here that these labels go directly up to the edge of the border. So there's no space in between the content and the border. So that is called the padding. If we let's add 30 pixels of padding. Now all of a sudden, we notice that these things have gotten a little bigger because everything's been shifted inside. So we have content inside. Outside of that content is padding. Beyond the padding comes the border. And then outside of the border is the margin. So if you want to think about how much size is our element actually taking up on the screen, we have to take into account all of the pieces of the box model. So we have the size of the content, plus the size of the padding, plus the border, plus the margin. And that is the gist of the box model. And it's just a general way that we think about all of the HTML elements on our page, to think about how they're relating to each other. And notice that when we start to add these things, it looks a lot better. So if we look back over to that first example, we can see that there's some margins and padding going on. When we remove our CSS, all of a sudden everything is just pressed up to the edge of the screen. There's a little bit of default space between the elements, but it's pretty cramped. So margin and padding is definitely important to think about when you're making your web page actually look good, look readable, be something that someone wants to view and interact with. So those are all of the properties that I wanted to show you in CSS. And as it were, the difficulty in styling doesn't really arise from HTML or CSS. Individually, I think they're both pretty simple to understand. But where the complication starts to arise is how they interact. It's this idea of the selector. So far, I've kept selecting very simple. I selected the divs. Everything that was a div is now styled. I selected the H2s. All the H2s were styled. But as you might have noticed, that's a pretty clunky way to go about doing things. And it doesn't really allow you as the coder a lot of versatility to make your page look beautiful, look exactly how you want it to. And that is where IDs and classes come in. So those are the two topics I want to introduce next. And let me actually change these font sizes a little bit, because I think it might be quite difficult to read what's on the page. So, oops. All right. So let's go back up here. So notice that my styles for the divs applied to both divs. And now any div I create is going to have a pink background, this border, and blue text. But maybe I don't want this to apply to every div. Maybe I just wanted it to apply to one specific div. We would do that with an ID. So I could go ahead and call this thing first div, or even just first, to keep it simple. So notice that this is another attribute that we can put on. So this attribute exists specifically to communicate with the CSS. That is really the only reason to have an ID, is to communicate with the CSS. So now this thing is ID'd with first element. So what we can do instead of selecting the div is we can select the ID instead. Let me actually put something in our second div so we can see it. Notice now that our second div isn't styled at all. The styling is just applying to this first div. So let's review what went on here. First of all, I put the ID on it. Syntactically, ID needs to look exactly like this, but this name could be anything you want. You know, it could be Garble. You wouldn't want to name it Garble because that's confusing. You want to name it something useful, but this name is something that you, the programmer, come up with. Then if we want to select, we have to use this hashtag. So if we just said first, it would be looking for an HTML element called first, which doesn't exist, I don't think. But when we use the hashtag, then it knows, okay, look for something that is ID'd first. And in that way, we can style one specific element. So that is an ID for you. And IDs are specific to just one element. So we couldn't have multiple things ID'd with first. There's just going to be one element on the page referring to first. Of course, everything inside of this element will still be affected by the style potentially, but just this one div has the ID of first. There's also something called a class that works in a similar way. If there were multiple things on the page that we wanted to share styling, we could use a class for that. So we could do class. Let's call this important. And I'll put it on spinach because we know spinach is important. We also know that CSS is important. And let's say that this header on the second div is important. So notice that unlike an ID, the class can go on multiple items. And also notice that two of these are list items, but one of them is an H1. So classes can hop around from different types of elements. And now if we want to style these three things, we can using this class. So whereas an ID was selected using a hash, we use a dot for classes. So we'll do dot important. And let's go ahead and do color red for those. And maybe we can make them a little bigger. So if we did font size 40 pixels, now these important items just got bigger. So in that way, we can start to get a little more sophisticated. So once again, classes and IDs, we first of all have to set them up in the actual CSS. So we add them to elements in the CSS with the intention of using them to style. So IDs can only go on one element, whereas classes can go on multiple elements. They're kind of like an umbrella that we can put different elements under. So simple enough concept in theory, but things start to get really complicated when you actually jump into how this works. So I want to spend a little bit longer just starting to explore how this starts to add up and how when there are conflicting messages coming from the CSS, how the computer determines which styles actually appear on screen. So I'm going to switch over to this other pen that I've created just to fill you guys in. It's pretty simple. We have 3 divs, each that contain a header and some text. Pretty boring, but a good place to start. So let's first look at styling some of these divs. I'm going to select the div, and I'm going to just start with a background color of, let's do light blue. All right, so we have a background of light blue over here. So first of all, I want to remind you guys that not only does and actually let me give it a font color too. So we'll do color of, let's make it purple, if I can spell purple correctly. Okay, so we have some purple text and some light blue backgrounds. So notice that by default, the div itself has these styles applied to them, but everything within the div kind of automatically inherits it. So our H3 and our P also get that purple color and the background as well. So that's a good place to start, is a reminder that when we have elements within our div or within something that's being styled, they will inherit that style from their parent element. So what happens if we do a second div? So I'm now going to say color red. So let's look at what happened here. I'm now starting to do some contradictory things. First, I said, here's how I want the divs to be styled. Now down here, I said, well, just kidding, I want the color to be red. So because this bit of code comes second on the sheet, it's going to be prioritized. So even though I first said color purple, it's going to look at the last place that I assigned the color. So the color appears red. But notice that that doesn't negate all of the code up here. So the background color still applies because there's nothing down here contradicting it. If I moved background color down here and said, let's say black instead, now this bit of code is being totally ignored. But if there's no background color specified here, then it just grabs the last place that a background color was assigned. So that is, this may seem like a silly example because why would you write div twice? But when you're dealing with a complex code base with lots of different assignments, oftentimes there will be multiple assignments happening on one element. And it's good to know which is going to be the one that's prioritized. And the first thing to note is that the second one will be prioritized if all else is equal. But all else might not be equal. So instead, let's say that I wanted to put an ID on here. So we saw that I could just do an ID, like, actually I'll do a class, sorry. So I have a few different classes going on here, class 1 and class 2. So if I want to do dot class 1, notice that on these first two elements that have that class on them, this one is prioritized. The color is purple. That is because classes always are prioritized over element selectors. So the code, regardless of order, the code will be interpreted as this one gets the priority because it's talking about a class. So everything with the class 1, with class 1 on it, will have these attributes assigned. And then this last div that doesn't have that class on it will just default to this selector. As you might imagine, IDs have even higher priority. So if up here I grab ID 1, and let's just go back to color black for this. The element on here with ID 1 gets color black. So this thing is within a div. It's within a div with class 1 on it, and it has ID 1 on it. So there are actually 3 bits of code that could refer to this element: the color red, the color purple, and the color black. But the code is going to, priority is going to be given to this bit because it comes from an ID. So let's look at the example of multiple classes. So we have class 1, but we also have class 2 going on here. So I will go ahead and do an assignment for class 2, and we'll say class 2 is color, let's do green. Okay, so what's going on here? It's getting even more confusing. So I'm going to break down this example. So first of all, notice that this whole thing has class 1 and class 2 on it. This very first div has both. So why is it reading class 1 instead of class 2? Simply because of order. If I swapped the order, if I changed, if I brought this one down below, things change. But let's put it back. So when all else is equal, this div is both assigned class 1 and 2. We go with whichever one is last on the list. So that is why we have text that is purple. So now let's look at this next one. So the div itself only has class 1. But notice that within it, this paragraph has class 2. So this paragraph is going to be overwritten. For just this paragraph, we're going to look at this code because it's more specific. It's on this specific element. But up here, the whole thing just has class 1, so everything else in it will default to the purple. And of course, this last element just has class 2 on it, so it just goes with the class 2 code. And of course, that overrides our div color that says to be red. So this might seem a little bit dizzying and a little bit confusing. All I can unfortunately tell you is yes, it is a bit confusing. This is critical to becoming a front-end developer, is being able to understand these subtle differences of how things are selected, what is prioritized, how to use classes and IDs, how to use the right selector. And I can promise you it will take practice. So the point of this final little example it definitely wasn't to overwhelm you. It also wasn't to necessarily make you guys feel like, yes, I fully understand this. It was to just get your mind to start to think about what are the challenges involved with using these classes and IDs. And there will be ample opportunity to practice these in the homework tonight and to continue to practice these as you go along in Lambda School and even in your career. This is not a trivial skill. This is really the crux of doing front-end design, is keeping track of these classes and IDs. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to be a master of this from the get-go, because it can get quite confusing and quite subtle. So that is mostly what I have for you tonight. There is a couple more things that I want to mention to you, and then I will open up the floor to questions. So the first thing I wanted to remind you of is these online resources. So as mentioned, you're not expected to have every single HTML element memorized. You're definitely not expected to have all of these properties in CSS memorized. In fact, I will go ahead and do CSS properties. And you can see that if we go here, there are tons of these things. So once again, there are many of these that you will not use very often, if not ever, but there are tons of these out there. So you're welcome to do some Googling, experiment with some of these that I haven't introduced, but I would start with trying to master the ones that I introduced tonight. But of course, the documentation is available for you whenever you need it. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is the idea of HTML and CSS libraries. So there's no coding for this part, so let me go ahead and unshare my screen. Hey guys, so let me talk a little bit about CSS libraries. So in the real world of web development, a front-end programmer is pretty much never actually writing raw HTML and CSS. So yes, back in the day, websites were designed using just HTML and CSS, which is why these examples kind of look like websites from like the late 90s, early 2000s. But there are all these libraries and frameworks that have come up that make this way easier and add this power on top of it. So I want to remind you again of what a library/framework is. Those two terms are kind of interchangeable, kind of not. For now, I would just think of them as being more or less the same thing. You'll start to develop an understanding of the subtle difference between them once you dive deeper into the world of programming. But essentially, a CSS library, something like Bootstrap, for example, is a tool that allows you to write CSS more easily. And as it were, CSS libraries are extremely popular. They're pretty much the professional standard. So you might be wondering, well, why are we bothering with learning the basics? Why are we bothering learning this raw stuff if that's not how things are actually done? And the answer is twofold. First of all, it's going to be really hard to learn the libraries if you don't understand what's happening behind the scenes. It'll also be hard to appreciate the libraries if you don't spend a little bit of time exploring how challenging CSS can be on its own. And finally, our idea at Lambda School is that we want you to be really nuanced programmers. And in order to be a nuanced programmer, you don't just understand how to use a library. You always need to understand why a library works and what might be happening behind the scenes. And in order to really get that, you need to kind of become a little bit of a master of CSS first. So in this boot camp, we're just covering run-of-the-mill CSS, HTML, but I wanted to make you aware that there's a whole world out there and that this becomes a lot more complex and powerful when you throw libraries in the mix. And of course, if you join our Lambda School main curriculum, we will teach you all about Bootstrap, and you'll start to see firsthand how these CSS libraries work. So, yep, that is pretty much all I have for you for HTML, CSS. I do want to go over the homework, and then I will open up the floor to questions. So I will share my screen again to review what the homework is a little bit, and then I will be open to questions. I know you guys have been chattering all throughout the lesson. I think that's awesome. I wish that I were able to interact a little more with that chat as we go, but happy to answer some questions in a minute here. Let me share my screen first. Okay, so homework. There are 3 assignments for you tonight. And as with yesterday, those will be shared with you via your PMs after the lesson. So the first one is more about reading code. So we have some HTML and we have some CSS that's actually commented out. So right now the CSS is there for you to read, but it's not appearing on the page. So make sure that you do not comment this in. The challenge of this is all about reading it and understanding it. So do not comment it in until you finish it. So the goal here is to look at this and actually get a sense of which color, which things on the page will appear which color. So it's really similar to that very last thing that I went over with you. It's all about trying to figure out what gets priority. And I will say this is tough, so don't feel like you have to get every single answer correctly, but just really think about it and give it your best guess. And then at the end, you can comment it in and check your work. The next 2 lessons are about actually writing code. So this first one, we have this page up here with some descriptions of what you need to do. Do not edit any of the HTML here. So don't change around the IDs and classes. Your challenge is to, by only writing CSS, get the style to match what's on here. So a little bit of practice with writing some CSS. And then the final assignment is a little more open-ended. We want you to create a website for a business. It can be something that you imagine. It can be something that actually exists or that you aspire to make one day. So it'll be your job to put some HTML elements on the page and to style them. There's some instructions up here on the criteria for that. So this one's a little more creative and a little more open-ended. And with the 3 of these, hopefully you'll be able to solidify everything that we've gone over tonight. So that is the homework for you. You'll be able to get into that shortly. And now it is time for questions. So let's see what you guys have for me. I see something about attendance. The attendance sheet was a one-time thing. So you all should have marked attendance yesterday, but you don't need to do that moving forward. All right, I see some people typing. Okay. Madison asked one of my favorite questions. Is there a built-in way to center things? Well, first she asked about, can you use anything other than pixels to change margins, paddings, border, etc.? The short answer is yes. You can also base it on, you can base things on percentage of the page. That's not something I really want to go over in detail, but I invite you to Google that and to explore that if you have some extra time on the homework today. I do want to talk about a bit about her second question, which is there a default way to center things? So let's start by showing you guys what not to do. So I'm going to go ahead and just pop one div up here. And all right, so here we have one div. Let me give it a background color. I'll do light blue again. Okay. And then let's give it a width of 200 pixels. Okay, so notice that this defaults to being aligned over here to the left. So if we want to center it, the first thing we could do that's pretty hacky is we could do a margin, right? So we can do a regular margin, but we can also specify a margin left. So let's say I did 500 pixels. That's too far. 300 pixels. Not precise, but it looks pretty centered, right? What happens when I scooch things over? All of a sudden, it's messed up. So if you try to center in this way, it might work on your local machine, but everyone is using different size monitors. Things are popping up on phones. This is a horrible way to center things. And it turns out that centering, while it might seem like an extremely simple thing, was kind of a nightmare in CSS up until recently. So the short answer for centering is that there's something called Flexbox, which is kind of new to CSS. And Flexbox, to actually show you how it works, is way outside the scope of this lecture, but it's something that has been built into CSS recently that does allow you to center things pretty easily. So that's not something we're going to be showing in this lesson. It is something that isn't too difficult to do, but I want you guys to appreciate it, because back when I was learning this, it was a real mess to try to center things without the help of a library. You had to actually do something called a media query, which allowed you to figure out how big the screen you were on was, and then calculate things, and it was just a mess. And now that's all done for you using something called Flexbox. Christopher mentions Flexbox isn't that new. Yes, there's it's not that new, but it's also not that old. And then there's also something called CSS Grid, which is an even better version of it. So yeah. Someone asked how we switch between the 3 assignments. You will be sent 3 different links for the 3 different assignments. We have someone asking, does the image need to be saved on my computer? No. So for example, the image I used up here was just something, there's a site called Pixum, which is a great place to find stock photos. That's where I went. And they give you the URLs. So you can just use the URL of the image, and then you can put it directly in. So image source, paste in the URL, and then there we go. So no, it does not need to be saved on your computer. Okay, we have some people asking about CSS preprocessors, more questions about Flexbox and FlexGrid. I don't really want to get into that in this lesson, because that could be a whole black hole. So that is one of those things. I will mention with CSS preprocessors, those fall into the category of things that are pretty much always used. A CSS preprocessor, something like less, for example, it's a tool that can be used to make this, to make things like selecting, which we saw can become kind of a nightmare, a lot easier. But I don't want to really talk too much about that, because it is a pretty big topic in and of itself. If you're curious, go ahead and Google CSS preprocessors. You can learn more about them. If you're curious about Flexbox, you can Google that. You could also look at some of our old videos from the pre-course, because back when it was a 3-week series, we did actually cover Flexbox, but too big of a topic to get into right now. All right, we have someone asking about IDs being used for multiple elements. So as a clarification with that, IDs can only be used on one element. So an ID is a single tag for one element, whereas a class can apply to multiple elements. But as we see here, a class or a single element can have both a class and an ID, and it could even have multiple classes. It could, I think, theoretically have multiple IDs, but I don't think that makes any sense. So you'd really only see one ID, potentially multiple classes. We have a question about why we removed Git from our lessons. So once again, Git is a topic that I invite you guys to Google if you're curious about it. It's a really big, important tool that's used in a lot of, it's critical actually to how collaboration happens in programming. But we did remove it from our pre-course because it's just not the best introductory topic. It's not the best thing to be the first place to start with programming, but it is heavily used in the main curriculum. So you will learn all about it if you join Lambda School proper. All right, we have a question about when you're actually doing a code base, linking. So let me find that code base I had earlier. There it is. So linking the CSS sheet. So someone asked, does this have to be in the same folder? Not necessarily. It should be in the same code base, and you're going to get into some trouble if it's not in the same code base. So I would just say, make sure it's the same code base. But let's say that I had a folder called CSS. And maybe within that folder, there's another style sheet. So I'll call this styles2.css. So if instead of linking something in the same folder, I could do CSS/styles2. So now it's looking for a folder called CSS and a file within that. So in that way, they don't have to be exactly in the same directory, but you want to make sure that everything exists within the same code base. It's just very bad practice to have something in a code base reference a file that is not within that code base. Okay, we have a question about multiple classes. So I'm just going to read this question out loud. So when it comes to assign classes to elements, you put 2 classes on one element and said it was taking one of the classes by order. But is CSS read from bottom to top, or did I get confused? So CSS is read from top to bottom. So I think I actually unfortunately deleted that example. But if I have class 1, it has, let me get rid of this stuff. So we have class 1, which has a background color of light blue, and then class 2, which I will give a background color of red. It's going to default to red. So things get a little confusing because there's an element within here with class 1. So let me delete that just to clarify. Okay, so this whole div has 2 classes on it, class 1 and class 2. Because they're both classes which have equal priority, the CSS will read whichever one is at the bottom. So it reads top to bottom. So this bit of code gets priority because it comes second. If I switch to the order, now we're looking at this bit of code. If instead this one were a div, now this one gets priority because a class is prioritized above just an element selector. Okay, I'm just going to take a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that you guys have plenty of time for homework. So keep throwing in the questions, but I might have to start skipping some of them. Okay, so we have another question about the multiple classes. So Katie asked, is there a reason that 2 classes would be assigned to a div? In this case, it doesn't make much sense, but let's say that we have a second div that has just class 1. And we'll put another header in there so we can see what's going on. Okay, so maybe we want everything that has class 1. Just let's fix this. So everything that has class 1 to have a background color of light blue. But let's say that we want class 2 to have a text color of green. So in this way, we could have a style that applies to everything that's class 1, which applies to 2 different elements. But in this case, class 2 only applies here. So this allows us to get subtle. So if we want a bunch of elements that have a light blue background, maybe class 1 is used heavily. But perhaps we only have a couple items that we want green text on, and we'll assign class 2 to those. So it's true that we wouldn't want, if we just had a single element that had both classes on it, that in and of itself wouldn't make sense. But when we start to get more elements and see the classes, there'll be some elements that have both, some elements that have one, some elements that have the other. All right, I'm gonna take maybe a couple more questions. We had someone ask, can a div work with one class? So no element is required to have a class. So a div can work on its own. It can work with one class. It can work with 10 classes. It just depends on what you want to do with your styling. All right, I think I might call it for tonight because I want to make sure you have plenty of time for your homework. All right, so that is it for the instruction portion of tonight's lesson. I know you guys probably have plenty of more questions. I hope that just by working on the homework, things will start to come together and some of these questions might be answered on their own. But beyond that, feel free to keep posting questions in Slack. People will be available to address those. You guys can also talk amongst each other. If any of you guys have more CSS, HTML experience and want to contribute, feel free to just start a conversation about this. So I'll be signing off here in a minute, and then as with last night, you'll be getting your homework assignment and you will have plenty of time to work on that and some time to come together as a group and discuss it. So that is it for tonight. Tomorrow, we are going to switch topics and dive into JavaScript, which is a lot of fun. So I'm looking forward to that. Good luck with the homework, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great night.